Hey y'all, my name is Cassie and I am the creator of Pieces of Scrap, and in today's video we are going to be doing another one of my AI pattern videos, the Will It Crochet series. It's been really popular with you guys, and in my last video, if you remember, I proposed that the next video in the series be a video where we test different AI generators against each other. So in this video, we're going to be looking at the same pattern 3 different times by different pattern generators. So the pattern that we've prompted 3 different AI generators to create is a brontosaur, a blueberry brontosaur pattern. And the way that it works is you tell the AI generator what you want. So in this case, he told each of these generators to generate a blueberry brontosaur pattern, and that is all that they get. They don't get any helpful hints about how to make the pattern better or anything like that. That is just the bare minimum of what we are giving these AI generation platforms to create these patterns. So the 3 chat engines that my husband used to generate these patterns are Gemini, which is a Google-based platform, and then he used ChatGPT. And then we also used Copilot to create a pattern. So those are our 3 chat engines, and it looks like I have 21 pages of pattern in here, and they're all in the same document. So each pattern has its own pages. It looks like they are fairly well-written patterns. We've got lots of different details in here. The first pattern is Gemini, and it looks like we have a key features section, materials needed section. There's a very long abbreviation section that goes into depth about different things that it tells us to do. And it also includes like repeats in here as well, which is really helpful. There's a special stitches section that isn't at the bottom of the pattern. If you remember from my last 1 or 2 videos, I think, the special stitches for each pattern was like at the very bottom of those patterns. So halfway through the pattern we encountered like a double crochet 2 together stitch, and it was just like not in the abbreviation section, so that was very interesting. There's also a note section, and then it goes into the pattern itself. We've got a head, neck, body, legs, tail, and there's also a tiny leaf accent in this pattern, which is optional. There's also a belly and neck underside panel that is optional. And it looks like there's also a blueberry crown hat that is detachable from this first pattern. There's also a tiny calyx. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly. It says to make 1 per blueberry. And then there is an assembly section for this first pattern. And that is all. So that is a very detailed pattern. It's a little bit different from what I'm used to when I'm seeing these patterns. The next pattern is ChatGPT, and it looks like the main difference that I'm seeing right off the bat is that there are a lot of emojis for each of like the headers for this pattern. There is a section at the top that tells you how big this thing is, as well as skill level and the techniques that we're going to be using. There's a materials section, key features and notes section, stitch abbreviation section, and then we go into the pattern itself. The pattern has a head and neck that's worked as one piece. There is a body section that you continue from the neck, and then there's tail section, legs, belly patch, spots or bobble ridge, and there is also a facial features section. And then there's also a blueberry crown hat that's detachable with blueberries and the top leaf for each blueberry, which I suppose is what the calyx is supposed to be. And then there is an assembly section, but it's a little bit less detailed than the Gemini pattern. I'm noticing right off the bat, it just kind of just tells you attach this piece to this piece. Now the Copilot pattern, there is a material section, abbreviation section. Then we go into a pattern overview, which tells you all the parts we're going to be making, which looks like head, neck, body, legs, tail, and blueberry crown. And then it goes into detailed instructions about how to make each of those pieces. Then after all of those pieces, it looks like it tells you how to assemble and the final touches we'll be making on those patterns. So let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to start with the Gemini pattern just because that's the first pattern on this document, and I will work in order, and I will check in with you guys occasionally to tell you my thoughts about how things are going with each of these patterns.
Hey guys, so the time-lapse section of this video I'm going to be doing a little bit differently than I normally do. Normally I put the instructions for each step on screen and show you every single bit of crocheting, but in this video I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to give you some key highlights about different things I noticed about the pattern as I was going along. So I didn't see anything in the head section that was very weird. The only thing that really threw me off here was just the placement of the eyes. It felt really weird placing them where it told me to in the pattern, but later it came out fine, so I just had to trust the process here. Then in the next section of the pattern, it was my first taste of just how big this brontosaur was going to be. It had 26 rounds in this part of the body alone, so that was super crazy, and it also had an option to extend it if you wanted an even longer neck. And then another thing was it has an optional underside color change section in the pattern, where in rounds 18 through 25 you can work the bottom 8 to 10 stitches in your color change belly patch color. So I ended up doing this, and it was a very interesting process. In the body section, it had, before all the instructions, an optional texture where you could replace some of your single crochet rounds with a pattern of single crochet bobble or similar, or use a slightly textured stitch like a grit stitch, which I didn't know what that was, but it says it's alternating single crochet and half double crochet, and that way you could make it look a little bit more bumpier or scalier. But I didn't end up doing that. That seemed like a lot of trouble, and it was already taking me a long time to make this brontosaur, so I just settled for single crochet stitches throughout this entire piece. The next section was the legs, and these were very typical for a leg. It has like a foot shape and then it tapers in to make the leg, so the foot portion of the leg is obviously a lot bigger than the tapered part. The weird part about this section was it says for 2 of the legs you can close the opening by sewing it flat, but instead I just single crocheted it flat. But for the other 2, it wanted me to leave them open so that I could sew them to the body in a rounded way, and to be honest, once I got around to sewing them to the body, it really didn't make a difference. I still kind of just sewed them flat, and here is the difference between those 2. Another thing I'll quickly note is I ran out of my main body color, so that's why we have a light blue leg. So because I ran out of my main body color, I wasn't able to do the color change at the tip of the tail that it wanted me to do. So it wants you to do like a color change where essentially the tip of the tail is a blueberry with a leaf sticking out of it. But because I ran out of that color, the whole tail is just the color of the blueberry, unfortunately. The tail section also called for me to make a tiny tail leaf accent, which I made 2 of because it seemed like it would be weird to just have one, especially with there not being an accent color for the blueberry at the tip of the tail, so that's why I chose to do 2. Next was the belly and neck underside panel, which says that's optional, but I think it's only optional if you make the color changes in the round. You were able to make color changes in the round for the belly portion, but I didn't do that because it seemed a little bit complicated, so I settled for making the neck transition in the rounds itself, but then I made this neck to belly patch, and I'm actually pretty happy with how it turned out, and happy that I did it at all because it kind of covered the transition really nicely from the neck to the belly panel. Next was the blueberry crown, and this is worked in 2 different patterns. So you have the small blueberries and then the little green part, which is called a calyx, for each blueberry, and it says you can make 3 to 5 blueberries using your blueberry color. So I ended up making 3 just because they came out a little bit bigger than expected, and I made 3 of these little green pieces for each, which were really easy to make. The pain was just sewing everything together. The blueberry crown had an assembly section, and it just tells you to arrange them in a pleasing cluster. And then you're supposed to use your yarn tails from the blueberries or a new strand of the blueberry color and sew those together securely at their sides to form the crown shape. But it was not very specific about what you were supposed to do. The facial features for the Brontosaurus section definitely took me some trial and error to get this mouth right. It just tells me to use black embroidery floss, embroider a small sweet smile below the eyes, and this definitely took multiple tries to get right. It just kind of looked weird the first couple times, and then I was finally I was able to settle for a decent result, I think. In addition to the mouth, you can also optionally embroider nostrils and blush for your cheeks. Next was actually just sewing everything together, which was my least favorite part of this project, but it just has to be done. I very loosely followed the instructions here, just because in order to make this pattern work out for myself, I was gonna have to be very creative about where I was sewing parts together. For example, for the neck, the open part where the belly patch is actually supposed to be where you sew it to the head, which makes no sense at all. So I flipped it upside down so that the belly patch is facing the belly instead of the bottom of the head, and I ended up just using these knitting needles to pin the head into the position I wanted it to sit, and then sewing through loops on both the head and the neck to get it looking as flush and the transition there looking as natural as I could with the stitches available to me there. I did the same thing with the neck to the body here. I wanted there to be a little bit of room for that neck transition of the belly patch to look more natural. So I pinned it kind of upright at like a 90-degree angle or so against the body. That way it would also make the neck curve a little as well, just from the head being a little bit top heavy compared to the rest of the body. Since I was working with one piece that was open and one piece that was closed, I was able to just use the front loops only on the neck, instead of having to go through full stitches on both body parts. After that, I pinned the underside panel to the body so that it kind of overlapped the neck panel a little bit, so we would have a nice transition there, and I just started sewing through one loop on the belly panel into the body stitches, and I was doing, I suppose, sort of a mattress stitch here, if you're looking for technical terms. But this was very tedious, making sure the edges stayed flush and the seam looked nice and it didn't look like super ugly stitching or anything like that. Not that it's something that you're going to be looking at prominently, but I still wanted it to look as nice as I could. The instructions that it gave me in the pattern was pin the panel to the underside of the neck and belly and carefully sew it in place using the long tail. So pretty vague instructions there, so I just kind of freestyled this just like the rest of the body parts as well. Next was sewing the legs on, and that flat seam that I created by just single crocheting the opening closed on the legs was really easy to work with, whereas the ones that I didn't single crochet closed were just kind of a hassle to work with. I didn't know how to make it look like the leg was rounded, and even so, I didn't really sew these on like I normally would, so I sewed the seam up in the back and the front of the leg, and then I went back along the sides of the leg and sewed maybe like 4 to 5 stitches on the sides of the legs to the body so that they would just stay standing upright and not swing open like you see it now. I didn't want it to be like a splooting brontosaurus or anything like that. I wanted it to stand up on its own, so it just needed an extra little bit of reinforcement here. This differs from the instructions because it just tells you to pin those legs to the underside of the body, not the side of the body like I'm doing here. And the front legs should be positioned slightly forward of the midpoint and the back legs slightly back, whatever that means. That's super super vague. I'm not sure what that means. And it says ensure the brontosaurus can stand balanced. So I'm glad that I added some support here on the side of the legs to fix that.
Hey y'all, so I have an update for you guys. I have finished the first pattern, which was by Gemini 2.5, which is Gemini Pro. We have that free with our new phones. We both have Google Pixel 9 Pros, and you get Gemini for free with that. So that is why it's a little bit upgraded. I think you can still do the same thing with Gemini in the free version, but it allows you to use like greater like thinking ability with the AI generation to make it like think deeper about what you want it to do. So here is the finished first pattern. It's kind of hard to get it all on screen for you guys, but it came out really cute. Main thing I want to note is that I did run out of my main body colors, so that is why the tail and the last leg are a different color from the rest of the brontosaur here, but I was really happy with how this little face turned out. It's actually pretty cute without all the embroidery on it. It was definitely looking a little goofy, but I really like how it turned out, and it's got this cute little flower, like it calls it a flower crown, I keep saying flower, blueberry crown. It's supposed to be detachable, but I don't know how I would have been able to get it to sit on the head and like stay on the head without just sewing it on. It's not really meant like shaped like a crown. It's kind of shaped like a triangle. You can make up to 5 blueberries, the pattern says, to create this crown, but I ended up only making 3 because 5 would have been a little bit too big for the size of this brontosaurus head, I think, but still really cute with all 3 of those blueberries on top. I also want to shout out the cute little belly patch down here. This is made in 2 pieces, so there are color changes in the neck that you make to start that little belly patch, but then you also create a separate piece that is just white working back and forth in a row instead of rounds, and then you sew it to the body, which took a while. I think all in all this pattern took me probably a little bit more than 4 hours to finish. These are giant pieces that we're all putting together, and then of course we had a lot of sewing involved. Each piece is made separately. We've got the head, the neck, the body, all 4 of the limbs, and then the tail. Then there's these little leaves at the end of the tail. That's also 2 pieces separately. Then we've got each green piece of the blueberry is done separately, and each of the blueberries is done separately. And then obviously you have to do all your face embroidery and sew all of the pieces on. And I don't know if I mentioned, but the belly patch is also a separate piece. So a lot of pieces here with this pattern, but it still came out really, really cute. This pattern is kind of like floppy. The neck kind of curves down and the head is a little top heavy. So naturally it wants to like lean down. It doesn't look super nice just sitting on like a table or anything like that. It can stand up, but it just, the tail and the face kind of droop down onto the surface that this is standing on, so keep that in mind. But I'm thinking that This came out really cute for the pattern, and it was a really detailed pattern. I really enjoyed making it. It was just like very large pieces, which I'm not used to crocheting. Typically when I'm crocheting amigurumi, I'm working with pretty small finished products. So for example, I have just finished a pattern test for Nook's hooks, and those were no-sew cows. Here is one of those finished cows. So as you can see, it's pretty small considering, but typically when I'm working with amigurumi projects, this is like one of the bigger things that I might make. So as a size comparison, this brontosaur is probably 3 times as big as this cow right here. It is a huge difference there. I have also gone ahead and started working on the next pattern that is written, and it is ChatGPT's pattern, and this is what we have so far. I was surprised that it was like all of this. This is the head here, this is the neck, and then this portion here is the body. That all of it is one piece. So now I have finished all of those pieces of the pattern, and I start to crochet the legs. Let's see what else. So next up in this pattern, I need to crochet the legs, tail. There's also a belly patch on this pattern, as well as some ridges or spots if I want extra texture. And then I make a blueberry crown as well, just like I did with the previous brontosaur. So all of those are extra pieces we'll have to make for this one, but if this is any indication, it's going to be a lot smaller than that first brontosaur, which is a relief to me because that one took just such a long time. And I'm also kind of relieved at the fact that there are just like less parts overall that I'm having to crochet so far. But main concern so far right now is just that this might end up being like a splooting blueberry brontosaur just because of this shape. It's going to be difficult for the neck to kind of sit upright, so that'll be one drawback to this pattern so far. But let's go ahead and finish crocheting and see how it turns out.
Hey guys, so I'm starting from the beginning of the pattern, which I've already crocheted in my last clip, but here is the start of the head, and it's actually worked continuously from the head to the neck to the body, which was really surprising to me. And the way that it's written in the pattern doesn't really immediately show you that those are all worked in one piece. The way that it's written makes it seem like number 1, head and neck worked as one piece, and then number 2, it says body, continue from neck. So you're just continuing, and the rows continue off, they don't restart either. So round 30 is the last round of the head and neck, and you go straight into round 31 for the body. But I want you guys to guess in the comments right now. Pause the video, guess in the comments how many rows this head to body section was, because it is very long, and I gave you a hint just now. When you get to the body, you're at round 31, but it's not done when you get to that point. So comment down below right now, pause the video, let me know how many rows you think this second Brontosaurus pattern took. Alright, have you guessed? It's 52 rounds, this head to body section. That is insane. Next up, I made the legs, and I kind of worked these the same as the last Brontosaurus. It doesn't have anything at the end that tells you to single crochet them closed at the last row, but I ended up just doing that because really I just prefer to assemble that way, especially when sewing. I don't have to worry about grabbing both sides of a limb and make sure it's like secure and not open and in any threat of losing any stuffing that's on the inside. So that's why I do that, and that's why I'm applying it here. It's just, it makes it easier for me to assemble later, and when I'm working on my own, I end up doing that almost all the time anyway. Comment down below to let me know if you do the same thing or if I'm alone in this. Next up, we have the tail, and this is worked really similarly to the Brontosaurus tail. It's a tapered tail, but again, Similar to the neck on the first pattern, the tail on this pattern tells you to sew the end with the magic ring, so you're starting round that is closed to the body instead of the open end at the end. Also, the open end that has the color change to make it look like the tail has a blueberry at the end of the tail. So just to preface, mine is backwards, but that is just because it doesn't tell me to sew the tail closed at the end of round 22, which is the last round. So the only way to remedy that is to sew the open end onto the body instead of the magic ring round. Next up, we have the belly patch, which I found to be hilariously small on this little brontosaurus. It is just a chain 7, and then you have 2 rounds after that where you're working around the chain, and it just goes on the underside. So I thought that was really funny, and how small it was. It's just like comically small compared to the body. The next step was assembly, and actually it seems like after you make each piece, it basically just wants you to sew those pieces to the pieces that they're supposed to attach to. For example, after the tail, it says stuff lightly, sew to back of body. And legs, it says stuff, sew under the body. Same with belly patch and all the other pieces that you have to sew on. So I thought it was kind of funny that there was like a separate assembly order section that tells you everything you're supposed to sew on with like no further detail at all. So something that is also really funny about this pattern is just like how out of order some of these things are. So next up in the steps after the belly patch, you're actually supposed to create the bobble ridge, but I find that really difficult to do without like having all of the pieces sewn on, specifically the legs and the tail. The reason I say that is because it helps to center where those bobble stitches for the spine detail, the bobble ridge, will go. And here you can see me, I'm just using a piece of scrap yarn to mark down the center of the body so that I know where those bobble stitches need to fall to create that bobble ridge. So to create the bobble ridge in the pattern, it just tells you to attach a color A or C, which is like your blueberry color or the green blueberry color, at the neck base, and you're just supposed to create 1 single crochet and a bobble stitch and repeat that down the spine and then slip stitch to finish, and that is all. It doesn't tell you like where to stop or anything like that. So I ended up stopping my ridge just before the tail, so at the base of the tail, just because that seemed like a natural spot to stop, specifically with that little blueberry round detail there at the end. Something else I want to mention is that I did have to go back. I left like a long tail after I fastened off so that I could go back and sew the open side of these bobble stitches down. You can see the side that's facing the camera is just like wide open. I guess if you really wanted to, you could leave that up and not sewn down to the body, but it was just a preference of mine that I didn't want that sticking up. I didn't want somebody to catch on it or anything like that and end up tearing it in the future, so that's why I ended up sewing mine down. I also quickly want to mention that the safety eyes instructions were not included in the pattern until after you have fastened off and closed the body. It's like the last thing in the pattern before you make the blueberry crown hat. And so because of that, I ended up embroidering some eyes, and I didn't do it on camera because it's just a little bit more difficult for me to do that while I'm filming. So that is why I ended up embroidering eyes instead of using safety eyes. And I also was just showing you on camera right here that I was thinking about adding blush, but I just didn't like what it looked like, so I just took it off. So like I was saying, the next part of the pattern is the blueberry crown hat. So it tells me to make 3 to 5 blueberries, and these are much smaller blueberries than the Gemini pattern, which I was very relieved about. These are probably about half the size of those blueberries, so I ended up making 5 of these. And the pattern was pretty similar. Not as many single crochet only rows. It just had one and then a decrease row. So I think overall the size difference there came from the overall height of the blueberry. In addition, the calyx, or that top leaf part of the blueberry, was a lot different from the first pattern. Instead of making that really simple star, it was more like a row of leaves that you kind of have to spiral around the top of the blueberry to make it look like any sort of star at all. So that took a lot of finessing as well to make that look right. The instructions in the pattern only tell you to sew to the top of each blueberry, so that was also really vague. And in addition to that, it also says that once you finish the crocheting of each of those leaves, it should look like a little star shape, but you don't slip stitch them together, so I don't know how that would happen. Here's what my crown ended up looking like. I added an extra little long leaf part to make the base of the crown, and I just ended up repeating the same instructions for the top leaf, but just like an additional, maybe like twice as many. So instead of 5 times, maybe I did like 10 times so that it could go around in a circle and be the base of this crown. And then all I did was I just sewed it to the brontosaurus head. And the reason I did this is just because it's secure that way and it'll sit the way that I want it to and stay there permanently. Unfortunately, I know that the pattern says it should be detachable as an option, but I don't know how to make that happen without it falling off constantly. Next up, we have the Copilot pattern, and right off the bat, I was noticing just how small this head was compared to the other 2 heads that I made, and I was actually really hesitant about placing my eyes, but I ended up just going with the flow, going with the pattern, trusting the process, like I said earlier, and it ended up actually turning out pretty cute. It was really small, which I wasn't expecting, and it kind of reminded me of like a turtle head, like from Crochet by Jenna's pattern book. I also ended up embroidering a mouth onto the face, just like it says to do in the instructions, and it actually turned out pretty cute and was not as much of a hassle as the first pattern was to embroider that smile. Next was the neck, and underneath the header, the title of this section, it says there should be a dual color effect where you begin in your main color and then switch to your lighter color for the underside of the brontosaurus. So I ended up following that, and I also ended up incorporating some of the optional bobble stitches for subtle texture in rounds 3 through 5. And that was something that was a feature that you could add in the first pattern, the Gemini pattern, but I opted not to. But I ended up trying it for this pattern and was pleasantly surprised with the outcome. However, something that confused me quite a bit was the fact that halfway through the neck, you're just switching to the belly color, and you're doing that for the entire round. It doesn't say, like, for example, that Gemini pattern, it said to like reserve 8 to 10 stitches for the belly patch and keep that same pattern going for the continuous rows. This one, it just says change to that color, and you don't ever change back to the main color. So you're just having continuous whole rows of your underside belly color, which was weird. It was so weird, in fact, that I ended up unraveling rounds 3 through 5 at one point, and I seriously debated whether I just like make it like the first Gemini pattern, but then I talked myself out of it because I told myself I just have to trust the process and do what the pattern says. Like, I can take little bits and pieces and adjust them just to make it easier for me, but then it wouldn't be true to this pattern. So that's why I ended up just sticking with what it says and doing what it says. Next is the body section, and this one is kind of the same thing as the neck. You just kind of eventually shift into the belly color randomly, and it's just like the entire row and not just a patch. But the main thing about this body section that's different from the other ones is that it has that option to add those bobble stitches to incorporate some texture, and it says to mimic the dimpled look of a blueberry, which I don't entirely get because blueberries aren't really dimpled. They have that one bit at the top that has like, I don't know, it's got like a hat on, is what I like to think of. I ended up incorporating some of these stitches in there, and I tried to like intersperse them as evenly as I could and made sure that they weren't like sitting on top of each other as well. So it says in the pattern to incorporate a bobble stitch on every 5th or 6th stitch, and to choose a few evenly spaced spots. So I ended up just like putting them in between each other, and then I stopped making them once I got to the belly band, which is the color switch. And it doesn't tell you to incorporate bobble stitches in that area anymore. In the end, this body section kind of ended up looking like an acorn, sort of. It's just not as long as I thought it would be. It was kind of short and stubby. Next up was the legs, and these were nothing really to write home about. They were short and stubby and kind of cute, honestly. The only thing I want to note here is that I did debate whether or not I should make 2 legs the belly color and 2 legs the body color, because the way that I planned on assembling it was to kind of line up the belly patch section on the neck and the body so that they connected, and it was like a kind of seamless connection there. So I was debating whether or not the legs that would be attached to the belly section would be the belly color, but I ended up deciding to just make them all the body color. So similar to the last pattern, each set of steps has its own like little assembly section where it tells you where to sew things to other things. So at this point I decided that I was just going to go ahead and sew together the pieces that I had, and then after that I would create the tail. So I pinned all the legs to the body using knitting needles and sewed them in place to where I thought looked best, and then I went ahead and I sewed the neck in place, and then after that it was the head, and I had to do some finessing to make sure that looked good and that it was a seamless transition and not jagged in any way, because of course we're fitting together 2 shapes that really don't want to be together. So I had to do some finessing here as well to make sure that looked flat as it could be. Next was the tail, and unfortunately, like the last one, it seems like this is worked backwards because we create that little blueberry tip of the tail at the open end of the tail again. This one doesn't have a ring of green around the top to show that like little blueberry leaf like the last one does, but it still has that little ring, and then it tells you afterwards to securely sew to the rear part of the body with that tail tip, the blueberry dark blue color being the tip of the tail, which is just wrong because it's open. So anyway, I ended up sewing this to the body the same way I did the last pattern, where the tip of the tail, the blueberry part, is actually just the base of the tail and is sewn flat onto the body. That was the best case scenario for the things that I was dealt in this pattern. Then finally, the last element of this pattern is another blueberry crown hat. For this one, I didn't really make a crown, admittedly. I was kind of fed up with making crowns, so I ended up only making 2 blueberries and kind of making them like ears coming off of the brontosaur's head. I thought that was pretty cool. But main caveat to this one, and why it's like my least favorite blueberry out of them, is that the little calyx detail on top says it's supposed to be a tiny star-shaped motif, but all you do to create this motif is you just chain 5 and join with a slip stitch to form a loop. So you're basically just creating a little tiny ring and attaching it to the top of the blueberry and calling it a star, and there's no way to make that a star. So it's kind of absurd.
Hey y'all, so I have finished all 3 brontosaur designs now. It took a lot of crocheting I think the first pattern that I showed you in the last check-in was definitely the longest. It took probably a little bit more than 4 hours, if not more. I wasn't timing myself because I don't plan on selling these. I plan on possibly giving them away. So yeah, the first pattern was by Gemini, and it is the paid version of Gemini, not the free version, just as a reminder. And here it is. It's gigantic. This is probably the biggest plushie that I've made in a very long time. I think the fourth wing dragons that I make typically probably rival this in size, but this one is still bigger and heavier overall as well. And I think that's in part because Big Twist yarn, which is what I used, is just a little bit denser in yarn weight. It's a little bit smaller overall when actually like in the typical yarn weight that you think of when you say yarn weight, but overall it's a little bit heavier, if that makes sense. So here is how that brontosaur turned out. You guys have already seen it. I opted for a 3 blueberry crown just because of the size of the blueberries. And like I was saying earlier, I ran out of the main color of yarn, so that is why one of the legs and the whole tail is my blueberry color instead of the main body color. The next pattern in the list of patterns I was provided was by ChatGPT, and you guys saw like the beginning portion of it, the first part, which was the head, neck, and body all together. And I have it finished for you all now to see. Here is how it turned out. So obviously a lot different looking than that first one. I opted to make more blueberries for the blueberry crown, and also something else that was a little weird was this green leafy part that goes on top of each blueberry wasn't like a finished circle. It was just kind of a row, and you're supposed to just arrange them on top and sew them on top to look like a star, but overall it was kind of like more of like a maybe like a rose crochet sort of assembly where you're like rounding it around itself, and that will make more sense when you look at the footage as well. But in addition to that, I also kind of supplemented something else to make it more of a crown. I made one of these little green leafy bits, but just like longer so that it would be like the base of the crown, so the blueberries aren't just sitting on this dinosaur's head. And then in addition, there was also instructions to add safety eyes or embroider eyes, but I chose to embroider eyes just because by the time I got the instruction to place safety eyes, it was well after the head, body, torso was all closed up. So that is why I embroidered safety eyes, and embroidered eyes, and it's a little bit different placement than the pattern tells you to do. I also opted not to include blush on this one just because of the placement. It just seemed a little weird with where the cheeks are appearing on my brontosaur here. It would have looked weird if I put blush on, and I think it kind of took away from the overall look of this brontosaur's face. But the main difference between this one and the previous one that I showed you is not only size, but there's also a spine detail that you crochet onto the back of the dinosaur. And also this tail is kind of worked a little bit weird. You're starting out on this side, which is your body color. So I assume you're supposed to attach your tail on this side to the body, but I opted on flipping it around because you don't close up the last row of the tail. And it's also kind of working in reverse when you're thinking about tail shapes. Like you start with this tapered end and you get larger. So I thought it made more sense to sew this part, which is supposed to be like the blueberry tip of the tail, to the body instead of having an open blueberry tail on the back. That is just something that I would do if I was working with a pattern that I found on the internet, or if I bought myself and I wasn't happy with how it turned out. That's something that I would do myself. And then another alteration that I made was I also single crocheted the legs closed just so that it would be a little bit easier to sew them to the body. And I suspected with the head, neck, and body shape starting out that this would have to be more of like a splooting dinosaur instead of like the last one where it kind of stands up on its own as best as it can. Just because of the overall body shape, it seems like it's more of like a laying down kind of dinosaur instead of a standing up kind of dinosaur. and how floppy the limbs are, I don't think it would have been able to stand up on its own. So those are some main things that I noticed about this pattern. Then finally, the last pattern was by Copilot, and it seems like we just progressively got smaller and smaller throughout each of these patterns, and here is how this one turned out. This one was definitely very funny to me when I was making all the different pieces, and the main thing that I found really funny about this is that this color change in the middle here is supposed to be the belly patch. And so when assembling this brontosaur, I had to be really creative about where I was sewing things so that it appeared like natural, that color change there. So that is why I opted for this type of assembly instead of maybe like assembling this part to the neck, because this is supposed to be the top of the body where this is supposed to be the bottom of the body, this lighter color. I think overall it looks a lot nicer than I think it would have if I was to assemble it differently here. And another thing that I had to do when assembling this was I had to really blend the transition from the neck to the head here. So I had to sew really creatively to make that look like it was one piece instead of the really blunt transition that it would have been. And then something this was similar with the last pattern, the ChatGPT pattern, is that this is supposed to be the end of the tail here again. It's supposed to be like a blueberry at the end of the tail, but because of the assembly where this side is like the rounded tapered end and this side is left open, I opted to flip that again. So we have a blueberry like at the base of the tail instead of the end of the tail here. So overall, I think the best engine here that we used to create a pattern was definitely Gemini. It seemed like the engine took a lot more time to kind of think through how to make the pattern make sense and how all the parts would come together to create a final plushie, whereas some of these other patterns, such as the smallest one and the middle of the road size one, ChatGPT and Copilot, they both did a decent job of creating parts that made sense together versus like previous episodes where we've had basically the same part made over and over again, but in different sizes. They did a pretty good job. I was surprised that I didn't see any of that in any of these patterns where it was just creating the same part every time. So that was a pleasant surprise. But I think overall, Gemini is the most reliable one in terms of making a pattern that makes sense together and making the final product make sense and making like structural pieces that fit together well. So something else I wanted to mention about the different chat engines that we used is that I was saying that Gemini was like a paid version, but that's actually not a really accurate way to describe it. What we are using is the Pro version of Gemini, whereas like the base version is called Flash and it does like really quick back and forths, whereas Pro just allows the engine to think deeper and use more in-depth reasoning to come up with solutions to the things you're asking it to do. And then in addition, Copilot, we used the think deeper function, which allows it to do kind of like the same thing. It just applies more reasoning to come up with solutions that will be better suited to your needs. So overall, lots of good engines out there. Gemini, in my opinion, has probably been the best one that we've used in this episode. So let me know in the comment section down below what pattern you think we should test these engines on next time, because I think this is also a really interesting concept and I'm really intrigued with testing this further. So let me know what you think we should make next time. And with that being said, I will see you guys next time. Bye!